December 29th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. A single American rifleman stares across 1,600 meters of frozen Belgian farmland at a tree that shouldn't exist. He has no scope, no binoculars, just iron sights and an instinct honed in the squirrel woods of his childhood. What he sees, or rather what he feels, will save the lives of over 100 men who don't even know they're about to die. But here's the thing: reconnaissance aircraft missed it. Intelligence officers missed it. Everyone missed it. Everyone except him. This is the story of Daryl Eugene Powers and the tree that wasn't a tree. The cold on the morning of December 29, 1944, was the kind that made bones ache before muscles even had a chance to stiffen. It crept through wool and cotton, through the layers of mud-caked uniform and into the marrow, settling there like an unwelcome guest that had no intention of leaving. Private First Class Daryl Eugene Powers lay prone in a shallow depression of frozen earth just outside the village of Foy, Belgium. His M1 Garand resting across his forearms, the metal so cold it seemed to burn through his gloves. His breath came in shallow puffs that hung in the air for a heartbeat before dissolving into the gray morning mist. Around him, the 101st Airborne Division's positions stretched in a ragged defensive line. Men huddled in foxholes and behind whatever cover the torn landscape offered, waiting for the next German assault that could come at any moment. The Battle of the Bulge had turned the Ardennes into a frozen hell. Hitler's last great offensive in the West had caught the Allies by surprise 3 weeks earlier, and now, as the year died in the grip of one of the coldest winters Europe had seen in decades, American forces clung desperately to positions like Bastogne and the villages surrounding it. Foy sat on a slight rise northeast of Bastogne, a cluster of stone buildings and bare trees that had become a chess piece in a game played with human lives. The Germans wanted it. The Americans needed to hold it. Between these two absolutes lay only snow, blood, and the mathematics of survival. Powers had been awake since 0400 hours, rotating through his watch with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had learned to function on 2 hours of sleep and bitter coffee that tasted like mud. But unlike the other men in his platoon, Powers wasn't simply scanning the German tree line for movement or muzzle flashes. He was reading it. His eyes moved slowly, methodically, from left to right across the distant forest edge approximately 1,600 meters away, cataloging every shadow, every branch, every subtle variation in the winter-dead vegetation. He did this every morning, had been doing it for 5 days straight since Christmas Eve, when his squad had first dug in at this position. To anyone watching him, Powers would have seemed like any other exhausted infantryman staring into nothing, waiting for something to happen. But inside his mind, a different process was unfolding, one that had its roots not in military training, but in the hardscrabble woods of rural America, where a boy with a single-shot .22 rifle had learned to outwit creatures far more alert and survival-oriented than he was. Daryl Powers had grown up poor in a way that made poor seem like an inadequate word. His family's survival had depended on what could be hunted, trapped, or coaxed from unforgiving soil. By the age of 7, he'd been sent into the woods with his grandfather's .22 and instructions not to come back without something for the pot. The rifle held 1 round at a time. Miss and you went hungry. Miss too often and your family went hungry. This was not sport. This was calculus written in the language of necessity. The squirrels in those woods had been his teachers, though he hadn't known it then. Gray ghosts that could hear a twig snap from 50 yards away, that could vanish into leaf cover so completely that even knowing where they'd gone, you couldn't see them. To kill a squirrel with a single-shot rifle, you had to understand not just where it was, but where it would be. You had to read the wind, the angle of light, the geometry of branches. You had to notice which trees had hollow trunks, which had nests, which provided escape routes. You had to see not the forest, but the architecture within it, the negative spaces where a small gray body might hide, the patterns that, when broken, revealed life. More than that, you had to understand stillness. A squirrel doesn't move when it knows it's being watched. It becomes part of the tree, trusting its camouflage absolutely. But nothing living can maintain perfect stillness forever. The twitch of an ear, the slight rise and fall of breathing, the micro-adjustment of weight from one foot to another. Powers had learned to wait for those moments, to recognize them in the corner of his vision, to understand that movement wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was just a wrongness in the pattern, a disturbance in the expected rhythm of things. By 14, he could walk into unfamiliar woods and within 20 minutes locate every squirrel within a 100-yard radius. Not by seeing them directly, but by reading what they disturbed. A branch bent at an unnatural angle, bark scratches too fresh, a configuration of leaves that didn't match the prevailing wind. He developed a catalog in his mind of what trees should look like from any given distance, how their silhouettes changed with seasons, how light played through their branches at different times of day. Then came the years in the machine shop. At 16, Powers had taken a job at a manufacturing plant, working the night shift as a precision machinist. The work required a different kind of seeing, the ability to measure with the eye tolerances of thousandths of an inch, to recognize when a piece was fractionally out of true, to feel through fingertips the difference between a surface that was right and one that was almost right. The shop foreman, a German immigrant named Hirsch who'd fled Berlin in 1937, had taken a liking to the quiet boy who never needed measurements checked twice. "You have the eye," Hirsch had told him once, speaking in his thick accent over the scream of the lathe. "Most men, they see what they want to see. You see what is there." The military had no category for skills like these. When Powers was drafted in late 1942, the Army had tested his vision 20/20ths, nothing remarkable, given him basic training on the M1 Garand, taught him to shoot at paper targets at known distances, and shipped him to England as a replacement rifleman. Infantry, one of thousands of interchangeable parts in the great machine of war. No one asked if he could read the landscape. No one cared that he'd spent his childhood developing an almost supernatural ability to detect anomalies in natural patterns. He was issued a rifle with iron sights, taught to fire in the general direction of the enemy, and told to follow orders. But Normandy had been different. Normandy had been chaos incarnate. A grinding meat grinder of hedgerow combat where the Germans exploited every fold of terrain, every stone wall, every hidden angle. Powers' company had been pinned down outside a village whose name he'd never learned, taking fire from an MG-42 emplacement they couldn't locate. The machine gun fire had come in bursts, professional and disciplined, raking the hedgerow they'd sheltered behind, kicking up dirt and splinters, chewing through anyone stupid enough to raise their head. Men were dying, screaming for medics, and nobody could see where the gun was positioned. Powers had pressed himself into the earth at the base of the hedgerow, breathing hard, his mind racing. The sound of the MG-42 gave a general direction, but sound bounced in the bocage country, reflected off stone walls and earthen banks, made everything seem to come from everywhere at once. Officers were shouting for someone to spot the position. Mortars were useless without coordinates. They were stuck, bleeding, dying by degrees. He'd raised his head slowly, just enough to peer through a gap in the vegetation, and scanned the field ahead. Nothing. Stone walls, scattered trees, shadows. Everything looked wrong because everything was strange. This was French farmland, not American woods, and the patterns were different. But then he'd seen it. Or rather, he'd seen what wasn't right. There was a shadow beneath a collapsed section of stone wall, 40 meters away at about 10 o'clock, that had a quality he couldn't articulate. It was too dark, too deep. The angle was wrong for the morning sun. The rubble around it didn't match the decay pattern of the rest of the wall. Stones stacked too deliberately, like they'd been placed rather than fallen. He'd had no proof, no visual confirmation, just a feeling. The same feeling he'd had 1,000 times in the woods when something was present but unseen. The sergeant was screaming for covering fire. Powers had aimed at the shadow, not at anything he could actually see, but at the wrongness itself, and fired 3 rounds in quick succession, working the Garand's action smoothly, placing each shot into slightly different positions within that dark space beneath the stones. The MG-42 had stopped firing. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then someone behind the wall had screamed in German. A high, agonized sound that cut through the battle noise. Another voice joined it. Powers had kept his rifle trained on the position, waiting. The voices had stopped. The machine gun never fired again. When they'd advanced an hour later and overrun the position, they'd found 2 German soldiers dead behind the collapsed wall, both shot through the torso. The MG-42 had been set up in a cunningly concealed pit covered with boards and camouflage netting, with only a narrow firing slit visible from the front. From Powers' position, it should have been impossible to see. The company commander had looked at the position, looked at Powers, and asked how the hell he'd spotted it. "I didn't, sir," Powers had answered honestly. "I saw where the gun was not supposed to be." The commander had stared at him for a long moment, then walked away shaking his head. But word spread. The quiet kid from wherever, nobody even knew what state he was from, could shoot, could see things. In the grinding advance through France, Powers had made shots that shouldn't have been possible with iron sights, dropping targets at 200, 300 yards while other men struggled to hit anything beyond 100. He didn't aim the way others did. He fired instinctively, his mind calculating wind, distance, and drop with the same unconscious mathematics he'd used to hit squirrels in trees. The M1 Garand became an extension of his perception, its weight and balance as familiar as his own hands. By the time they'd reached Belgium and the winter closed in, Powers had developed a reputation. Not as a sniper, those men had scopes, special training, operated alone or in pairs, but as a rifleman who could hit what he aimed at and see what others missed. His platoon sergeant had started positioning him where he could observe, trusting his judgment in ways the Army manual never authorized. "Powers sees shit," the sergeant had explained to a skeptical lieutenant. "Don't ask me how. He just does." Now, on the morning of December 29th, lying in the frozen mud outside Foy, Powers was doing what he'd done every morning since Christmas Eve. Counting trees. The German tree line was roughly 1,600 meters distant, a dark smudge of winter-bare forest that marked the enemy positions. With the naked eye at that distance, individual trees blurred together into an undifferentiated mass. But Powers had discovered that by using a technique he'd developed as a child, slightly unfocusing his eyes and looking at the negative space, the gaps and silhouettes rather than the objects themselves, he could distinguish individual trees by their shapes. The tall, narrow one, the one with the broken top, the forked one, the cluster of three that looked like a hand reaching up. He'd started cataloging them on December 24th, creating a mental map of the tree line from left to right, assigning each distinctive tree a position in his memory. It was a compulsive behavior, born of boredom and the need to do something, anything, useful during the interminable wait. By December 26th, he'd counted 112 trees that he could consistently identify. By December 28th, that number had grown to 140 as he'd refined his ability to distinguish between similar silhouettes. This morning, moving his gaze slowly across the tree line in the gray pre-dawn light, his mental count reached 141. He stopped, backed up, counted again. 141. There was a tree that hadn't been there yesterday. Or rather, there was a shape among the trees that his mind had registered as a new tree. His pulse quickened slightly, but he forced himself to remain still, to keep his breathing steady. Could be wrong. Could be the light playing tricks. Could be he'd simply missed it before. But as he focused on the shape, positioned slightly forward of the main tree line, perhaps 20 meters in front of the forest edge, something about it nagged at him. The symmetry was too perfect. Natural trees grew asymmetrically, responding to light, wind, competition for resources. They leaned, twisted, developed irregular branch structures. This shape was balanced, centered. Its silhouette had a geometric quality that felt manufactured. Powers watched it for 10 minutes, barely breathing, applying the same patience he'd used stalking squirrels. Nothing moved. No birds landed on it. The shapes around it, the real trees, showed the subtle motion of wind in their uppermost branches. This one didn't. It stood perfectly still with the stillness of something that couldn't move because it wasn't alive. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Still there. Still wrong. The light was improving now as dawn approached, and he could make out more detail. The tree appeared to be roughly 4 meters tall, positioned on a slight rise that would give it an elevated field of fire across the approaches to Foy. If he was right, and God help him if he was wrong, that position would have a commanding view of the American lines. Perfect for an anti-tank gun or heavy artillery piece. But why would they move a gun into position now, after holding their current line for days? What were they planning? The answer came to him with cold certainty. They were planning an assault. Probably at dawn on the 30th, which was less than 24 hours away. They'd moved the gun under cover of darkness, camouflaged it perfectly, and positioned it to provide direct fire support for an infantry advance. By the time the Americans spotted it during the attack, it would already be killing them. It was a perfect ambush, executed by men who understood their business. Powers low-crawled backward from his position, keeping below the sight line, until he'd reached the relative safety of a shell crater 15 meters behind. Then he made his way quickly to the platoon sergeant, a grizzled 30-year-old from Pittsburgh named Kowalski who'd survived North Africa and Sicily and had the scars to prove it. "Sergeant," Powers said quietly, "I need to report something." Kowalski looked up from the cold rations he'd been trying to chew. "This better be good, Powers."
"I'm eating breakfast."
"There's a German gun position in the tree line. Approximately 1,600 meters, probably an 88 or something similar. Moved into position last night, camouflaged to look like a tree." Kowalski stopped chewing. "You see this with the magic powers of your mind, Powers? Because last I checked, you don't have a scope and 1,600 meters is a hell of a long way to identify anything." "I've been counting the trees for 5 days, Sergeant. Yesterday there were 140. This morning there are 141. The new one doesn't move in the wind. Too symmetrical. Wrong position relative to the natural tree line. It's a hide." The sergeant stared at him for a long moment, jaw working on the tough ration. Other men might have dismissed it, probably should have dismissed it, but Kowalski had seen what Powers could do, had watched him make impossible shots, had learned to trust the quiet kid's instincts even when they seemed insane. "You're telling me you counted 140 goddamn trees, and now there's one more, and this means Jerry's got an 88 pointed at us?" "Yes, Sergeant. And if you're wrong, I'm going to look like an asshole when I report this up the chain." "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski sighed, tossed the K-ration aside, and stood up. "Come on. You're going to explain this to the lieutenant. And Powers? This better not be you cracking up from the cold." 20 minutes later, Powers was standing in a ruined farmhouse that served as company headquarters, trying to explain to Lieutenant Morrison and Captain Webb how he knew there was a German gun position 1,600 meters away that no one else could see. Morrison, a recent replacement who'd arrived 2 weeks earlier, looked skeptical. Webb, older and harder, listened without expression. "You counted the trees," Morrison said flatly. "Yes, sir. All the trees. The distinctive ones, sir. Ones I could identify by silhouette at that distance. And now there's an extra tree." "Yes, sir. One that wasn't there yesterday." Morrison glanced at Webb, clearly thinking this was nonsense. But Webb was studying Powers with narrow eyes. "You're the one who made that shot in Normandy. The blind shot through the wall." "Yes, sir. And you've been hitting long-range targets with iron sights since France." "I do my best, sir." Webb stood, walked to the window, or what had been a window before artillery had removed that section of wall, and looked out toward the German lines. 1,600 meters. Can't see shit from here. Could be anything. Could be nothing. Could be you staring at nothing for so long you're seeing things that aren't there. "Could be, sir," Powers agreed. "But you don't think so?" "No, sir. I think they moved something into position last night. Heavy weapon. Probably planning to use it tomorrow at dawn during an assault. Position's too good to be accidental." Webb turned back to him. "If I call in artillery on your ghost tree and it turns out to be an actual tree, I'm wasting shells we don't have many of, and I'm giving away that we're watching that section of their line. If you're right and we don't hit it, a lot of men die tomorrow. You understand what you're asking me to risk?" Powers met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I understand. But I know what I saw, or didn't see, sir." The silence stretched out. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Sergeant Kowalski stood by the door, arms crossed, face unreadable. Outside, the muted sounds of war continued, distant artillery, the occasional crack of a rifle, men coughing in foxholes. Finally, Webb nodded once. "Give me the coordinates. Best you can estimate. I'll request a fire mission." 2 rounds, high explosive. If there's nothing there, we chalk it up to bad intelligence. If there is. He didn't finish the sentence. Powers provided the coordinates, estimated from his position and the landmarks he'd memorized. Webb relayed them to battalion. The request went up the chain, was questioned, justified, approved. At 1,545 hours, 2 American 105mm howitzer rounds shrieked across the cold afternoon sky and impacted in the German tree line. The first round hit 30 meters left of target, sending up a fountain of frozen earth and shattered wood. Powers watched through borrowed binoculars, his heart hammering, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The second round hit closer, maybe 10 meters right, and in the cloud of smoke and debris, something was revealed. The camouflage netting burned. The false branches collapsed. And there, exactly where Powers had said it would be, sat an 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun in its ground mount configuration, one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal, capable of destroying tanks at 2 kilometers and devastating infantry positions with its high explosive rounds. The third shell, called in by an excited forward observer who'd finally seen what his binoculars had missed, hit the gun directly. The explosion was spectacular. The 88's ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction of secondary detonations that continued for 5 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the position was obliterated. Later reconnaissance confirmed 6 German soldiers dead, the gun destroyed, and an elaborate camouflaged emplacement that had taken them most of the previous night to construct. The assault came anyway. The next morning at 0630 hours, German infantry emerging from the tree line in a desperate attack that was met with devastating defensive fire from the American positions. Without the 88 to suppress the defenders and provide heavy fire support, the attack faltered within the first hour. Casualties were still heavy on both sides. This was the Ardennes, where nothing came cheap, but the American line held. Later analysis suggested that the 88, positioned where it was with perfect fields of fire, could have killed or wounded upwards of 150 men in the first minutes of the assault, potentially breaking the defensive line entirely. Daryl Powers saved those lives by counting trees, by noticing that 140 had become 141, by understanding, with instincts honed in childhood poverty and teenage labor, that something about that distant silhouette was wrong. He received no medal. His name appeared in no reports beyond the after-action summary, where Captain Webb noted, with typical military understatement, enemy gun position identified and neutralized by artillery fire based on infantry observation. Powers wouldn't have wanted recognition anyway. He was simply relieved he'd been right, relieved he hadn't wasted shells on a phantom, relieved that the men in his platoon who'd shared cold coffee with him that morning were still alive that night. But the war wasn't finished with him yet. January brought more bitter fighting as the Allies pushed back against the German offensive. The forests gave way to villages, then to small cities, and the nature of combat changed. Urban warfare was a different beast entirely. Not the long sight lines and natural cover of the countryside, but close-quarters brutality among ruins and rubble, where death came from windows and doorways and could be hiding behind any wall. His platoon was clearing a town whose name, like so many others, would blur in memory with all the other shattered collections of stone and horror. The Germans had withdrawn, or most of them had, but snipers had stayed behind. Dedicated men with scoped rifles who'd volunteered to die slowly, alone, trading their lives for Allied casualties. It was a mathematics of attrition. Each sniper might kill 3, 4, 5 men before being hunted down. Each death delayed the advance. Each casualty lowered morale. They'd lost 2 men that morning to a sniper they couldn't locate. 1 shot each, both headshots, both men dead before they hit the ground. Professional work. The kind of shooting that required training, patience, and a very good position. The platoon had gone to ground, moving only in short dashes between cover, trying to spot the shooter. Standard doctrine was to call in tanks or artillery, reduce likely buildings to rubble until the sniper was either killed or flushed out. But they had neither available. They were on their own. Powers had taken cover in a doorway, breathing hard from a 30-meter sprint across exposed street. His mind was racing, trying to think like the sniper. High position. Good field of view over the main street, probably 3 or 4 stories up, far enough back from the window that the rifle barrel wouldn't be visible. patient, waiting for targets to present themselves. The 2 kills had come from different angles, meaning the sniper could move between firing positions, or there were multiple snipers. Powers thought it was 1 man, 2 windows. More efficient, more patient. He scanned the buildings across the street. Most had taken damage. Walls collapsed, roofs gone, windows empty like dead eyes. Too obvious. The sniper would be somewhere less damaged, somewhere that still provided cover. His gaze moved methodically from building to building, window to window, looking for what? He didn't even know. A glint of glass? Snipers knew better than to let sunlight reflect off their scopes. Movement? A professional wouldn't move unnecessarily. So what was he looking for? Then he saw it. Not a thing but an absence. 1 window, 4th floor of a building that still had most of its facade intact, was darker than the others. Not shadowed, dark, like something was blocking the light from inside. And as he watched, the darkness shifted. Not obviously, just a flicker, a redistribution of shadow that suggested depth, space, something present that was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Powers didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't question. He brought the M1 Garand to his shoulder, settled the front sight post on that window 60, maybe 70 meters, not a difficult shot if the target were standing in the open, but this was just a maybe, just a feeling, and fired. The Garand bucked against his shoulder. The window shattered, and a split second later, a figure appeared in the broken frame, pitching forward, a scoped rifle falling from nerveless hands to clatter on the street below. The sniper followed, tumbling out and down, hitting the pavement with the terrible finality that only a 4-story fall provides. The street was silent except for the ringing in Powers' ears from the shot. His platoon mates stared at him, then at the dead German, then back at him. Sergeant Kowalski was the first to speak. "How in the holy hell did you see him?" Powers lowered his rifle slowly, his hands shaking now with adrenaline. "I didn't. I saw where the light was wrong. They found 2 more bodies in that building later, men the sniper had killed earlier in the day. The German had been a Wehrmacht sniper with 6 confirmed kills marked on his rifle stock. His scope was a premium Zeiss model, and he'd been positioned perfectly, patient and professional. But he'd made one mistake. He'd put himself in a position where the absence of light revealed him to someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to see absences. The months that followed blurred together in the way that combat does. Days of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The slow grinding advance into Germany. More villages, more forests, more death. Powers continued to see things others missed, to make shots that defied the limitations of his iron sights, to survive through a combination of skill and luck that even he didn't fully understand. He never received specialized sniper training, never got a scope. He was just a rifleman who was very, very good at his job because that job happened to require skills he'd learned trying not to starve as a child. When the war ended in May 1945, Powers returned home with a chest full of ribbons he didn't talk about and memories he couldn't escape. He went back to work in a machine shop, married a girl from 2 towns over, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet life that gave no indication he'd once saved hundreds of lives by counting trees. He never told his children about the war. When asked, he'd say he'd served in Europe, done his duty, and been glad to come home. The details he kept to himself. In 1987, a historian researching the Battle of the Bulge came across Captain Webb's after-action reports and noticed the notation about the German gun position. Following the paper trail, he eventually tracked down Powers, now 64 years old and retired, living in a small house with a garden he tended with the same meticulous attention he'd once applied to tree lines and machine tolerances. The historian asked him about December 29, 1944, about how he'd spotted a camouflaged artillery piece at 1,600 meters with the naked eye. Powers had been quiet for a long time, sitting in his workshop among the carefully organized tools, the measuring instruments, the pieces of wood he shaped into furniture for his grandchildren. Finally, he'd said, "I grew up hungry, real hungry, the kind where you learn to see things or you don't eat. I learned to see things, trees, shadows, what belonged and what didn't. The army gave me a rifle and told me to shoot Germans. I shot Germans. But the seeing part, that wasn't the army. That was growing up poor and learning that if you paid attention, really paid attention, you could survive. I just never stopped paying attention, even when it wasn't squirrels I was looking for. The historian asked if he'd ever received recognition for what he'd done, for the lives he'd saved. Powers shook his head. Didn't need recognition. Those men got to go home. Some of them probably had children, grandchildren. They got to live their lives because a gun didn't kill them. That's enough. That's more than enough. He died in 1994, surrounded by family who knew he'd served but never understood what that service had meant. His obituary mentioned his work as a machinist, his membership in the local VFW, and his love of woodworking. It didn't mention that he'd once seen what reconnaissance aircraft and intelligence officers had missed, that he'd killed snipers who'd thought themselves invisible, that he'd possessed a gift so unusual the military had no name for it. It didn't need to. The men who'd stood in those foxholes outside Foy on the morning of December 30th, 1944, had gone on to live lives, raise families, grow old. They didn't know why the expected German assault had faltered, why the devastating fire they'd been told to expect never materialized. They just knew they'd survived another day in a war where survival was never guaranteed. That was Daryl Powers' legacy. Not medals or recognition, but lives lived, futures granted. The quiet multiplication of existence that happens when men who should have died are allowed to go home instead. In the grand narrative of World War II, he was a footnote, a single rifleman among millions, his actions barely recorded, his name forgotten by all but a few researchers who stumbled across mentions of him in dusty files. But in the intimate arithmetic of individual existence, in the sum total of all those unmurdered futures, he was something else entirely. He was proof that war is decided not just by generals and tanks and bombers, but by men who notice things, men who pay attention, men who learned, as hungry children in American woods, that survival depends on seeing what others miss. The tree line outside Foy stands today much as it did in 1944, though the scars of war have long since healed. Trees grow where the 88 once sat, their roots deep in soil that holds fragments of steel and bone. Tourists occasionally visit, following guides that tell the broad strokes of the Battle of the Bulge, the encirclement, the siege, the eventual Allied victory. No marker indicates where Powers lay in the frozen mud and counted trees. No monument commemorates the 150 men who didn't die because a poor boy from rural America had learned to see. Perhaps that's appropriate. Powers wouldn't have wanted a monument. He just wanted to go home. And when he did, he brought with him the quiet knowledge that attention, true, patient, unwavering attention to the world as it actually is rather than as we expect it to be, can change everything. A single tree that shouldn't exist. A shadow that's too dark. A flicker of light that's wrong. These are the things that separate life from death, victory from defeat, the future from its absence. In the end, that's what Daryl Eugene Powers understood that others didn't. The world is always speaking, always revealing itself, but only to those who've learned to listen with their eyes, to see with patience, to recognize that survival, whether in woods full of squirrels or forests full of Germans, belongs to those who notice what others overlook. He wasn't a hero in the way we usually define the word. He didn't charge machine gun nests or lead desperate assaults. He just paid attention. And sometimes, in war as in life, that's the most heroic thing of all. If you found this story as powerful as I did while researching and writing it, please consider subscribing to the channel. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, and your subscription helps make sure they reach more people. Hit that like button if Daryl Powers' incredible attention to detail and self-taught skills moved you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think there are unsung heroes like Powers in every major conflict? People whose civilian skills made all the difference but were never officially recognized? Have you ever heard similar stories from your own family's history? Or know someone whose unique background gave them an edge in an unexpected way? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.